Numbers.
Deuteronomy.
All right, very good. What's the next section?
History.
Very good.
Joshua. Judges.
A little bit. There you go. Then you got the first.
First Samuel, Second Samuel,
Second.
First Kings,
Second Kings.
First Chronicles,
Second Chronicles. That'd be good. Ezra. Nehemiah. Esther.
All right, what's the next section?
Minor, major prophets.
No.
Minor. Oh,
History. With,
with, oh, yeah.
Yep. All right.
getting rid of stuff.
Job, Psalms,
Proverbs. Song of Solomon.
One before that.
Ecclesiastes,
Now,
Song of Solomon.
there you go. All right, what's the next section?
Minor
major
prophets.
prophets.
Major prophets. You almost there, Ronnie. Just hold that one. You almost there. You almost there.
You're jumping a good thing.
All right, what's the first book? Major prophets?
Job, Psalms. We don't-
Oh.
yeah.
Isaiah.
There you go.
Yeah,
Jeremiah. Lamentations. Ezekiel. Daniel.
All right. Now what section we in, Ronnie?
Minor.
Minor prophets. There we
You
go.
probably got yours in.
All right, what's the first book of the minor prophets? Starts with an H.
Hosea,
Yeah, there you go. Hosea. Starts with an A.
Amos,
Amos.
Joel.
Oh,
Joel.
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 Joel. Good
Yeah.
Amen.
All right, what's the next one? Remember a little bit in one chapter book? That's right. Obadiah. All right, and then the one that pretty much everybody knows. Talks about fish.
Oh, Jonah.
Jonah.
All right, and what's the next one? What are we in today?
Micah.
Micah. Very good. We are in the book of Micah. All right. Book of Micah. Now, there are some things that tell us. Now, this is one of those books that does give us a little bit of information about who wrote it, when it was written, you know, the historical context. So that makes it a little bit easier as we go along to, you know, interpret different things because we know those details. And so in this, we know that the authorship is Micah. It says right there in the very first word, in the first verse, the word of the Lord that came to Micah. Then it tells us where he's from. He is from Micah of Moresheth. And so that is, let's see, right there. So that's just southwest of Jerusalem. So that would be considered blue collar territory. So some scholars say that possibly Isaiah, because Micah was a contemporary of Hosea and Isaiah, and do you remember what that means of being a contemporary? Do you remember what I explained about that? It just simply means that they prophesied in the same time span on some of the similar things. So if I was to say that Micah is a contemporary of so and so, that just means Micah was prophesying
About the same time.
about the same time. So Micah is a contemporary of Isaiah, because Isaiah was prophesying around this same time too. So Isaiah probably would have been older at this time, and Micah, some of the stuff in Micah sounds very similar to what Isaiah was prophesying. So Micah could have very well could have known Isaiah, and as well known as Isaiah was, I would say it's probably a pretty sure probability that he knew Isaiah, knew of his works. Possibly, he could have even talked with Isaiah. But I know one commentator made this suggestion, and I would have to agree that anytime there's an older person in the ministry, seeing a younger person in the ministry take the mantle and continue that work, it's always a proud moment. And and the same thing with parents, who are Christians and seeing their children grow up and be Christians themselves. That it's a proud moment. So Micah seems to come just a little bit after Isaiah, but around the same time. And so we know where he's from. The other thing is that it tells us the time frame in which it happens. It says that it happens in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So we know that time frame. That's a time frame in the middle of the 8th century down through the 7th century. So that you're looking at the 750s down to the 680s BC is around the time frame here. And so that puts it in historical context. The other thing here is, as we get into the historical context of this, this is right before, if he started his ministry there in the beginning of what he talks about in the 750s, then Assyria was at that time building power, and they were conquering nations, but then he would have seen the Assyrian Empire come in and destroy the northern capital of Samaria within the same time frame that he was prophesying. Because it was under King Hezekiah that the Assyrians were launching an invasion on Judah and Jerusalem, and Hezekiah had prayed, and the Lord had heard his prayer, and the Lord had said through a prophet, said, hey, you're not going to have to go out and fight them. I'm going to fight them. And that was when the Lord took care of 185,000 Assyrians without the army of Judah doing anything. And because of that, that sent the king of Assyria back to Nineveh. That was King Sennacherib, and they sent him. Seeing what God had done, it sent him back, and he was eventually killed by his 2 sons a short time later. So that gives us the time frame that these things were going on. Now we know that in the beginning here, as he's talking, Micah is somewhat similar to the book of Jeremiah, in that this is not the way that this book is written, it is not like telling a story chronologically from one end to the other. It's more of a collection of almost essays or prophetic sayings. So it's not put together sequentially or anything like that. And obviously, as we read the first part of this, and he's talking about the coming destruction of Samaria, then we know that at least this prophecy took place before 722 BC, because that's when Assyria came down and destroyed the capital city of Samaria and the northern kingdom of Israel. See, right there's Samaria.
I see it.
So that, whenever Assyria came in and destroyed, they took out the entire northern kingdom. But usually, the capital city is where people would go. And because just like with most, states today or other countries or whatever, usually the capitals, that's the point of where the higher ups, the kings and all that, that's where they would be. So of course, that's where
Better jobs.
that's where you would want to go. If you were a conquering nation, of course you would want to take out the biggest and most powerful city, which is normally the capital city. Now this was a time that if the prophecies had been listened to, and perhaps Judah did listen to some of these prophecies, because Judah was not destroyed. Jerusalem itself, now Judah, there were several cities around Judah that had been destroyed as the Assyrians and Babylonians came down. But it was a little while, it was 586 BC before the Babylonians came down and completely wiped out Judah and Jerusalem. So perhaps some of the prophecies that Hosea and Isaiah and Micah had prophesied concerning these coming judgments, perhaps some of them were listened in part by people in Judah, and that delayed the coming judgment. Now, God had prophesied that judgment was coming. But just like with Nineveh, like we talked about the other week with Jonah, God had said that judgment was coming. He actually sent a prophet to the city, judgment is coming. Now God didn't lie, but because of their repentance, He relented. And He allowed that generation of people to repent of their wicked ways, and He spared them. Now, Nineveh did meet their destruction. Nineveh did fall. Babylon came in and completely destroyed Assyria, took over their kingdom and expanded their own. And so it was about 120 years, 125 years later that judgment that God had pronounced did come true.
Well, that proves that God is sovereign. He does things in His time.
That's exactly right. He is sovereign, and the only thing that can persuade Him to relent, I guess you'd say, is repentance, because that is the ultimate objective.
Well, you mean you talking about putting off judgment?
Yes. Yeah. And we see that throughout, the Bible, especially with the minor prophets. We see it quite a bit. That's kind of a cornerstone that you see in the minor prophet books, is God, bringing judgment and is pronounced through these prophets, and then to see Him relent of some of those, even if for a short time. But He does carry out these things. But He also relents when there's true repentance to be found. So, but that gives us kind of the historical context of what's going on, and so we'll get into the meat of the stuff here. Now, as I said at the very beginning of this, it tells us who He is, where He's from, the historical context, but it also tells us who His prophecy is for. And His prophecy, it says there at the very end of verse 1, it says that He saw this concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. And sometimes whenever they list cities, like capital cities, they do that to talk about the entire nation. So Samaria, which is right here, would have been synonymous with saying Israel, so the northern kingdom. And then down here with Jerusalem, Jerusalem was the capital city of Judah. So in essence, he was talking about this is for the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, the first few verses there, it talks about the judgment of Samaria. It talks about the different things that are going on there and how injustice against the Lord is taking place. And then the latter part of chapter 1, it switches gears and talks about the judgment on Judah. But something here that starting in verse 10, working down through verse 16, is that he starts listing several cities. And it's interesting how he's talking about these different cities. And here's more of a larger version so that you can see. He says, "Tell it not in Gath," in verse 10. So here's Gath. And he talks about, there at the end, talking about going to Adullam. Now what is interesting about this, that it is, if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 10, and go through 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 1, it lists those same cities in that order. Now, I mean, does it have any bearing on this at all? Maybe not. It's just an interesting thing. But I think what it shows is how they used trade routes, because those were the main routes to get around. And so, this was the route that David used when he was fleeing from Saul. Now, in this case, the Assyrians, this is the route that they used to go and invade Judah, or I should say, on their way to invade Israel, the northern kingdom. So just a little interesting side note there, that how they listed the cities and all that, and that tie-in with King David. But just one of those little interesting little nuggets that, you know, comes up from time to time. In chapter 2, this is where it kind of gets into talking about why God's sending judgment. And in the first few verses there, it gives us a pretty good idea of what they're doing. Verse 1 says, "Woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds." So anytime you see a message from a prophet that starts with woe, you better listen. And of course, you know, there's a section in our Bible, in the New Testament, where a certain somebody uses 7 woes. Do you know where that is? And who said it?
Revelation.
Was it God said it?
It was Jesus.
Yeah, okay.
When Jesus was
Same
talking,
thing.
Jesus, yeah, it is the same thing. Jesus was talking to, I was going to say, boy, you real close. But Jesus, you know, had these 7 woe statements there in Matthew, and you should really read them because they're it's some of the harshest language that Jesus uses in the New Testament, talking about how most of it's geared towards Pharisees, about how they treat people and how lax they are in their leadership and all of those things. And
What verse was that in Revelation? What chapter?
it's in Matthew.
Oh, in Matthew?
I'm trying to think. I can tell you in just a minute. I can't think of it right off my head, but I can tell you in just a minute. But that's an interesting little place to read. As I was preparing this, if I would have thought about that before I prepared this, I would have already had that, but I didn't think of it until just now. That's why it's not coming to me at the moment, but I'll get it to you. But here he talks about, he says, "Woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their bed." So here it talks about people who are actively seeking out to do ill will. You know, today in our legal system, we call that motive. You know, these are people who are thinking about, you know, the different ways in which they can carry out evil deeds. So that tells you something right there. It says, when the morning dawns, they perform it, because it is in the power of their hands. So not only are they thinking about it, not only are they plotting, but then they carry it out. This is what we would consider premeditated. And so, like with murder charges, this is the harshest one that you can get, premeditated. That means that you planned it in advance. You know, it wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't an accident. You know, it wasn't self-defense. This was premeditated. You planned on doing it, and then you carried it out.
First degree.
Yeah, so this is the worst type of malice that you can carry out. So that tells you, gives you frame of mind where their heads were at and where their sin was at. And another interesting point there, it says, because the power was in their hands. That tells you where this is leading to. Verse 2, it says, they covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them away. They oppress a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. Now, I think in another translation, it says that they rob him, or they rob this citizen. Now, what I would like you to look at here is that in this initial couple verses, as it tells us what they're doing, it's telling us that they're breaking some of the fundamental laws of the Old Testament. So let's look at a couple of those. Now, what are the basic laws in the Old Testament? The Ten Commandments. That's the basic law, right? All right, when God came down, He gave the 10 basic laws, and then you can spread out from there. But He gave us 10 basic ones because you got 10 fingers and 10 toes, so it's easy, you know, it's used to remember. You know, it's an easy way to remember. All right, so let's look at a couple of these because He mentions 2 of them right here that really gets under God's skin. Well, they all do, but you know, these 2, this is what they were doing here. You can turn to Exodus chapter 20, because that's where you find the 10 Commandments. Exodus chapter 20. And we're going to look at the 8th and the 10th commandment. Now the 8th commandment is found in verse 15. All right, you shall not steal. Now he said, Micah said that they were seizing land and robbing them. All right, so there's theft. That's stealing. Now on the other hand, go down to verse 17. And you shall not covet your neighbor's house. All right, so you know, obviously there's some other things there too, but he also mentioned that there. They wanted what was not theirs, and so because of that envy, because of them wanting to take that caused them to steal and rob. Now, it also, I guess it could be said that in some places here it does mention that there is life that is lost. Now we know in other books, we do know that they were killing their own people. So you could go up here and you could look at the 6th commandment, which says you shall not murder. So there's a lot of commandments here that are being broken. Now again, I've said this a lot of times, and a professor brought it to my attention, and I tend to agree with him on this point, that when you start breaking that first commandment, the other ones are soon to fall.
Yeah.
And so their biggest and main problem was that God was not their sole God. When God said, "You shall have no other gods before me," that is what led them, because they were worshiping other gods, that's what led them down the road to do all these other misgivings. Now, if you go through and you break down, you go back and look in the Old Testament, like in Leviticus, go through Exodus, because after you pass the Ten Commandments, there are other laws. Some of these basic laws are broken down even further. So you'll find more law in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, if you go through and look at all those 613 laws all together, it breaks it down more. They broke some other laws too, about how they treat people, how they treat their own people. And so they were breaking so many laws. It would have been, the laws that they were breaking, this book would have been a lot longer if they would have wrote them down. So, but that goes back, the reason I pointed this out is just to go back to say, look, they went back and they just broke basic law. That's a starting point right there. You can live a well-balanced life by just following those 10. And so they couldn't even do that. Now, as we look, if we look at starting verse 6 here, go back to Micah chapter 2, verse 6. Now, after some of that stuff was listed as far as what they were doing, there's an indictment there. Starting with verse 6, there is a rejection of the prophetic word. Verse 6 says, "Do not preach. Thus they preach. One should not preach of such things. Disgrace will not overtake us." Now, what that's saying is remember how we've talked about in some of the other books, whenever some of these false prophets had the ear of the priest and had the ear of the king and associates, and the king would ask them for advice. And these false prophets would say, "You know what? We're the people of God. We know that all these sins are taking place, but we're the people of God. He's not going to destroy us." Even though God specifically sent prophets to them saying, if you don't shape up, you're going to ship out. And so a good example of this is Jeremiah. Remember Jeremiah? He went before them and told them, said, "Look, you're not telling the truth." There were other prophets that we've already studied who has also went before leaders and said, "Hey, these people aren't telling the truth." And so what he's saying here is that, he's talking about the false prophets speaking. Now, as you read down, again, he talks about some of the things there that's going on, things that they're saying, some of these false prophets. And just like with another book, where there's some sarcasm, verse 11, I think, is sarcastic in nature as well. It says, "If a man should go about and utter wind and lies, saying, 'I will preach to you of wine and strong drink,' he would be the preacher for this people." Doesn't that seem like a little sarcastic nature? What he's saying is if somebody went out and that was the thing they were preaching on, was drinking wine and drinking strong drink and having a good time, he's saying that would be the preacher for these people because that's what they're doing. That's what they like. So that's a sarcastic voice. That's a sarcastic statement in response to them, saying that's the type of leader that they would follow. in a lot of cases, you could relate that to things that are happening in the church today with church leaders. There's certain things that church leaders say that get their congregants' attention. Jesus said something about this, about tickling people's ears. That's the kind of preacher that they want. But what a preacher ought to be doing, or in this case a prophet, should be telling the truth.
Amen.
Even if it's something that he knows or she knows that the crowd is not going to like.
Right.
And so, that's what he's talking about here.
Make them up.
You know how much I like sarcasm, so I always, anytime I see that in the Bible, I got to highlight it because it's like that's somebody right there. I could relate to that person. As we get into like a very quick shift where he's the prophet, and this is similar to what we've already seen, but a prophet will give a word from the Lord. It's a scathing declaration of the judgment to come and the things that they're doing wrong and their failure to repent and X, Y, and Z. And then all of a sudden, here comes this swift change in pace. And there in the last two verses, you see this kind of repentance shift. It says, "I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. I will set them together like sheep in a fold, like a flock in its pasture, a noisy multitude of men. He who opens the breach goes up before them. They break through and pass through the gate, going out by it. Their king passes on before them, the Lord at their head." So this is a future promise of restoration. Now, who is the leader? Who's the head that they're talking about? They're talking about this future Messiah, the one who's going to lead them back to where they are. It is kind of a throwback to that promise made to David of a king always being on the throne in that line, and of course that's the messianic promise, and of course that is Jesus. So this is a foreshadowing statement or a predictive statement about Jesus leading his remnant back to where they're supposed to be. Now, as we get into chapter 3, it starts off as an indictment against the leaders, the elders, I guess you would say, the head, the people that have the leadership roles of each kingdom. Now, listen to what he says here in the first 4 verses. He says, "And I said, Hear you heads of Jacob, and rulers of the house of Israel. Is it not for you to know justice, you who hate the good and love the evil?" Now, as you look at today's landscape, when you look at, I don't like to call them leaders. Now, there are people who are leaders if they're not elected. If they're elected, that's all they are. They're not leaders. They're representatives. The leaders are the people who put them there. So here you got people who are saying, you are leaders, but as leaders, shouldn't you know something? And I was thinking about this yesterday. If you watch, and you have to go on some place where they actually show everything. I know it is boring as all get out, but if you ever watch C-SPAN where they're doing these hearings, where senators are addressing, or not leaders, but addressing certain heads of, different agencies. You would think that a head of an agency, like I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, trying to think of what his title is. Anyway, this particular person, part of his job is border security. That falls within his purview. And so several senators were asking this particular person about things that are going on at the border. And this guy had no answer for any question that he was asked. Now, being in that position, don't you think he should know something about those things? Because they're pretty important. You know, like how
What did
many...
he say?
Huh?
What was his comments?
He didn't know.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know...
That's terrible.
And that's just one instance, but you can go through, if you really sit down and watch these things, they're really telling. And the reason nobody watches them because they're so boring. And another reason is if you pay attention to know what's going on, as you watch them, you'll really get upset. Because these people have no business being in any of these positions because they don't know what they're doing. You would think, you know, when you put somebody in a position, they should know what's going on. And if they don't know what's going on, they shouldn't be there. But if they are there, they should know what's going on. So here, going back to this, he's saying, you know, you people, you're the heads of this thing, you're the leaders here. Is it not for you to know justice? We could say the same thing for church leaders. Is it not for you to know justice? You know, people in positions of leadership within a church, they should know things. And if you look in the New Testament, it gives guidelines. You know, that's why it says, don't put a new Christian as an elder. Because as a new Christian, you're just learning things. You're just learning you're in those baby steps of Christianity. That's why it says you need to have somebody who is seasoned. Someone who has lived in Christianity for a little while and has taken those steps of sanctification. But leaders ought to know what they're doing. And these people, they should have been aware, or they were aware, because it says that they were purposely doing these things, but they were aware. But because they are aware, I think that makes them more culpable.
Well, say that just goes all the way to the top. You got a vice president. She don't know where she's at.
Well, I don't really think she's that either, but...
I mean, she was
former senator.
Things go to the top.
Yeah.
She was in charge of, supposed to be in charge
Yeah.
of the southern border.
Yes.
She don't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sad.
It is, and that is a good example of somebody. That entire administration are inept, bunch of fools, because none of them know what they're doing.
Just like he's got one that's supposed to be in charge of all them ships that are lined up out there. He's on maternity leave with his lover.
Yeah,
That's what.
I know.
Move.
I know. So yeah, you know, it's
To me.
there's a lot of similarities between the things that are going on that a lot of the Old Testament prophets talk about, that we see within our own government, that we see within our own churches. You know, we see this in civic organizations. You see this you also see it in civil rights, supposed civil rights organizations. You know, the ACLU, when they first started, they actually at times did some good.
Right.
Now they've strayed away from that because of their leadership. You know, the NAACP at times in their early beginnings actually did some good things, but because of their horrible leadership, they no longer resemble what they once stood for. So you can find this in any group of people. When people who know better ignore those things.
What's that black guy that wears that red hat, ball cap, that's on Hannity? He used to be
Leo.
Leo. He used to be
Lawyer.
a lawyer for the
Civil rights.
civil rights.
Yeah.
And he would turn Republican.
Yeah. Well, that was somebody who actually opened their mind and allowed facts
Well, they're elders.
and
Yeah,
truth.
yeah, we
Yep.
get to know.
So,
I don't know what happened there, I really don't.
That was a crooked election.
well, we can't talk about those things because it might take this video down.
I don't,
Video now.
Because YouTube likes, they act like dictators, you know, don't follow the First Amendment, but, and I don't know, our channel might be so small that there ain't enough people watch it to even catch their attention, but we want people to watch this without it being taken down from the YouTube overlords, so, gotta be kind of careful. Let's steer back in the direction of our lesson today, but wasn't trying to go that route per se, but just, I think it makes things more relatable when we see present day circumstances that are similar to what they were facing there.
yeah.
But we do see people who are in leadership, you know, it says after asking them, don't you, shouldn't you know justice, you who hate the good and love evil, you know, we see that today. You know, we got people who are calling good bad and bad good, up is down, left is right. I mean, you know, we're seeing this today, and that's similar there. But, talking about this leadership, it talks about, now this kind of graphic here, he says, who tear the skin from off my people and their flesh from off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people and flay their skin from off them and break their bones in pieces and chop them up like meat in a pot, like flesh in a cauldron. Now within this context at this time, I think this is a using this as an analogy of how they're treating people. They're basically chewing up people and spitting them out. I think that would be a common thing. That's a modern day equivalent saying. And we do know that there were times that when destruction came upon the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, that there were short instances of cannibalism. But at this time, I don't think that this is exactly what this is referring to. Like I said, I think this is just kind of making an analogy of what they're doing. So it's treating them very poorly. It's basically taking everything from them and just treating them so poorly. And then verse 4 says, then they will cry out to the Lord, but He will not answer them. He will hide His face from them at that time, because they have made their deeds evil. Now, we know that they did this. We know that when judgment came upon them, we know that these leaders, they were crying out to the Lord, like, oh, why us? Why are you doing this? When they full well knew why God was judging them. It was because of all their evil deeds. They knew better. So, it's you do all these evil deeds, and then it's like,
No consequences.
it's like, why am I in trouble? Well, you're in trouble because you did that. Because you weren't supposed to. I mean, that's simple stuff, right? But they did this. And so God judged them. As we continue here, He goes from the leaders and then He goes to the prophets. Verse 5. He says, thus says the Lord concerning the prophets, who lead my people astray, who cry peace when they have something to eat, but declare war against him who puts nothing into their mouths. So, here what this is saying is that when they're not being challenged, everything's good. But when, say, for instance, let's use Jeremiah again. Now, the prophets who were speaking to the king at this time and to the leadership, they were false prophets who were saying, don't worry, Babylon's not going to destroy us. We're God's people. We can handle this. peace. But then as soon as Jeremiah come in, then it was different. Because what did they want to do? They wanted to war against Jeremiah. Because Jeremiah challenged their assessment, because Jeremiah was telling them what the Lord had said. These people were speaking from their own agenda. They were speaking from their own place because they were being taken care of. They didn't care about anything else. As long as they were being taken care of, everything was good. Now that prophet coming in and challenging that, now that might shake things up. So they had no choice but then to cry war against them or war against them. Now you notice that, where it talks about then they will cry to the Lord. Well, the prophets did the same thing, because when Babylon did come, they cried out. Remember there was one. Remember Jeremiah said, a year from now you're going to drop dead? Well, them people, they remember that when that guy dropped dead, because they brought it up. Remember how when Jeremiah said, hey, Jeremiah was right. He's dead. So the prophets, they get theirs. Talks about how they'll be disgraced. These false prophets are going to be disgraced. And God is the one who's going to disgrace them. And He did. Because there were very few prophets during those days who were saying what God was telling them to. So there were very few that made it through that. And those are the ones that we know about. Just God listened to, or God talked to them and they listened to God. Now, verse 8 here, he says exactly why they ought to listen. He said, now this is Micah talking, he said, but as for me, I am filled with power, with the Spirit of the Lord, and with justice and might, to declare to Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin. So, he's saying, he's telling them right off the bat, he's like, look, this is not from me. This is not from my place. This is not from my thoughts. I'm filled with the power of the Spirit of the Lord. So he's saying, it's the Lord who is speaking to you. It is the Lord who is judging your sin. That's what he's saying. So he's saying that's what you ought to listen to. That's why. Now, and that was also a thing too, because, in order to prove a prophet true, his predictions had to come true. And so, that was one of the things of being anointed with the Spirit during that time. That was a crucial element of being considered a prophet as well. So if you look back at the other prophets prior to Micah, that was one of the things that was evident. Isaiah, it was very evident. With Hosea, it became evident. With Elijah and Elisha, it was evident that the Spirit was with them. As Jeremiah came along, it was evident that the Spirit was with him. And so all of these things, with being filled with the Spirit was a pretty important thing, because that made it true. He goes back in verse 9, he goes back and he talks to the leaders and the prophets and the people all at once. In verses 9 to 11, he's saying that it was the people, or it was the leaders, who basically allowed all the misdeeds to happen, because leadership, when you have poor leadership, typically that trickles down to a worse people. Because there's always people who are just followers. And right now in America, there's a bunch of followers. There's not enough people who think for themselves. And so, we see here that there were people who did think for themselves. They didn't just follow blindly. And so that's what makes bad leadership so bad, is when you do have a lot of people who mindlessly follow anything that they say and do. And so we know that we've already talked about and described how inept and cruel and evil the leadership was, so the people were following along. So, it generally comes down, who takes responsibility here? Who should be accountable? Well, it falls back to the individual, because, they all should know better. But remember, Jesus talked about those who would have great responsibility. You know, those who have great power will come great responsibility. And so that rang true in the Old Testament as well. Those leaders had great power. It also come with great responsibility. So he puts it back on them. Now, let's look at, now, verse 12. Verse 12 is one of these places, little interesting side notes here for a couple of reasons. It says, therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field. Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house a wooded height. All right, so Micah says this in the 700s, probably. He could have said it as I guess as late as the late 600 BC. Now Jeremiah didn't come along until the 500s. Well, he prophesied for quite a while during that time, but remember Jerusalem was destroyed in 586, so Jeremiah was prophesying for a few decades there. Now, this verse is important for this reason. Let's turn to Jeremiah chapter 26. Now this is something that we brought out, but if you remember the movie that we were watching on Jeremiah, it talked about this very thing. It showed a visual portrayal of this. Jeremiah chapter 26, verses 16 through 19. Jeremiah 26, 16 through 19. It says, now this is when Jeremiah was under trial. It says, then the officials and all the people said to the priests and the prophets, this man does not deserve the sentence of death, for he has spoken to us in the name of the Lord our God. And certain of the elders of the land arose and spoke to all the assembled people, saying, Micah of Moresheth prophesied in the days of Hezekiah king of Judah, and said to all the people of Judah, thus says the Lord of hosts, Zion shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house a wooded height. So Jeremiah, all right, so this does tell us that when Micah prophesied this was in the late 600, because that's when Hezekiah was the king. But it also shows that Jeremiah and the people held Micah, his works, in high esteem, because they remembered exactly what he said. That Zion should be plowed as a field. And then verse 19, it said, did Hezekiah king of Judah and all of Judah put him to death? Did he not fear the Lord and entreat the favor of the Lord? And did not the Lord relent of the disaster that he had pronounced against them? But we are about to bring great disaster upon ourselves. So, you know, in this instance, Jeremiah people wanting to kill him because of what he said, because he was telling the truth. And so they wanted to kill him. And so these people stood up and said, no. We're going to go back and talk about biblical precedent. We're going to go back and quote one of the prophets. And so, you know, that's what they did there, similar to a court proceeding today, because precedent matters. And so this set a precedent. There's a lot of things with our court system that the Founding Fathers did that resemble a lot of biblical things. Especially, you know, with all of our laws and things. It's interesting when you get into that stuff.
Well, that's the way it was set up.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
It was set up biblical.
Well,
I mean, this
not
country
entirely.
was set up biblical.
Not entirely. That was not the main purpose. That was not the main purpose. But there's a lot of founding elements of the Bible. So I'm not going to dispute that, because it is. I mean, it's anybody who says that the framework of our Constitution and the wording of our Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights doesn't have some foundation in the Bible, they're just not being honest.
Right.
They're just telling a falsehood. But it was not entirely framed upon this, but a lot of it was. And for good reason.
They had, the founding sponsors were biggest part of them were Christians and didn't believe in slavery.
There was a large portion of them that were Christian men. Some of them weren't. But the basic ideals of liberty, of freedom, those things mattered to those people because they had lived under tyranny.
Now, that's why they come to America.
So it's like Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was not a religious man. He was someone who wrote his famous book, The Age of Reason. Now, he didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus, but he was one of our founding fathers. But he believed in freedom, he believed in liberty, he believed in the concepts of what was going to come as far as the framing of the Constitution. He believed all those things. He just couldn't get past the divinity stuff. But he did record that although he did not believe the divinity of Jesus, or those things like being born of a virgin, being crucified and coming back to life, he didn't necessarily believe in those things. He did believe that the teachings of Jesus should be taught and followed. So, I mean, it's a weird thing. He was kind of an atheist, but he also believed in, I wouldn't say he was an atheist, but he definitely wasn't a Christian. But,
Well, he had ethics, so,
But he believed.
He had to be raised.
But he was the one who coined the phrase United States of America. There was something else that he coined too, and I can't remember what it was, but there was two major things that started with our founding that he coined. And, he, not being a Christian, but believing in the founding principles of putting this nation together. It's a pretty amazing story. But Jeremiah here, it was important because this is quoted now. Here, this is just a side note. Micah 3:12. We've looked at the minor prophets, half of them. We're going to get to the other half week after next. Going there. One of the interesting things about Micah 3:12 is that it is the very center verse of the minor prophets. And if you look at the major context of the minor prophets, it talks about the destruction, the judgment that God's going to bring on His people, especially His capital city in Jerusalem, Zion. And what does Micah 3:12 say? Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house a wooded height. So it's very interesting that is the very middle verse of the centerpiece of the minor prophets. Just an interesting side note there on that. Get into chapter 4 here. Now chapter 4 talks about restoration. So this takes a break from the judgment, but it namely talks about the restoration. Said that verses 1 through 5 talks about the nations approach Zion in peace. So of course we know, if you look at this is something that will take place at a later time. Because right now, as we've talked about many times, the nations are not coming to Zion in peace. A lot of nations around the world want to obliterate Israel, so we know this time has not yet come. And then also, in verses 6 and 7, it talks about the divine promise to gather in Zion. So we know that is not that hasn't necessarily taken place either. Now we do know that there are some Jews who have gone back. You know, since Israel became a state again, a nation, we do know that there's some that have gone back, but we know that there are larger populations of Jews in other parts of the world than there are in Israel. But that is something that will continue to take place. But this is also talking about a future time. In the rest of it, the rest of chapter 4, it talks about, again, talking about the restoration of Zion. But it does talk about going into, let's see, where is that, 9, chapter 4, verse 9. This kind of goes back to where this comes back to present day at that time, talking about how Babylon is going to come and destroy them. And it talks about how the Lord wants to save them. Now we get into chapter 5. Chapter 5, this goes back to talking about that future shepherd that was mentioned earlier, about leading the flock. And so it's talking about, here's this remnant that is going to be restored, and it's going to have this shepherd king. He arrives and he leads them. So this is a kind of a rallying cry to his people here in chapter 5, talking about the things that's going to come, the leadership they're going to have, because remember we just talked about how poor the leadership was, and they should have been looking at the model of leadership that God had laid down through the centuries, and they weren't doing that. And so, here they're going back to this. All right, here's what good leadership's going to look like. Here's what God leadership looks like. And so this gives them a hope, but also gives them that promise of restoration. Now, as we get back into chapter 6 goes back to judgment. Verses 1 and 2 just talks about how the indictment has been called up, and the Lord hears it, and the Lord is going to bring judgment on His people. And then in verse 3 through 5, I just want to touch on this because I think this is important. Chapter 6, verses 3 through 5, it says, "O my people, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you?" And notice how he says, "Answer me." He wants an answer. So he's asking this question about, what have I done to you? So, let's just ask that question. What has God done for them?
Brought them out of Egypt.
Yeah. Not just that, but a whole lot of things. I mean, there's a lot of things that God did.
Provided them clothes and food when they went through the wilderness.
Exactly. So not just that, he provided a way. He provided a way while they were in Egypt. He blessed them while they were in Egypt. He blessed them when they left Egypt. He blessed them when they crossed the Red Sea. He blessed them in the desert. Remember, He provided a pillar of fire by night and a cloud during the day to lead them across the desert. He provided for them while they were in the desert for 40 years. Remember, their clothes, their sandals never wore out. They were fed, they were watered. He provided all those things. Remember, they multiplied during that time. He brought them to the promised land, not once, but twice. And He gave them their land. He fought for them. You think about all those things. And then look about how He blessed them during the reigns of David and Solomon. He blessed them immensely. So, trying to say, God asked, what have I done to you? What have I done for you? When God asks it, it's a rhetorical question. God knows what He's done. He's wanting them to remember. Because they ought to know. Right? They ought to know what He's done.
They ought to.
So He asks them that. Then he reminds it, after He says, "Answer me." He says, "For I brought you up from the land of Egypt, and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, devised, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord." So he takes them through a quick history lesson of when he brought them out of slavery and their time in the desert. He says, just think back to just that time. And there's a lot that happened there. Another thing that we didn't say a while ago is that God gave them the path to life. The law.
Oh, yeah.
The law was their guiding principle. Now remember, it wasn't, they were never going to follow the law perfectly because they couldn't. But it was striving to follow the law because it was God who gave it to them. And by following that law and doing so willingly, as they were following God to paths of righteousness. Because following the law would lead to a righteous life by having faith in God. So God has done much. We know that. In verses 6 through 8, and this right here, verses 6 through 8 is really, this is a simplification of what God wants. Within people, now we know by reading the New Testament, we know that people during that time had a problem with this as well. There were legalistic people who tried to follow the law without actually trying to follow God. Does that make sense? They were doing everything they were supposed to do in the law, as far as like tithing and sacrificing and all that, but they were treating people poorly. They were not, because remember, anytime, like with the Pharisees, anytime Jesus would heal somebody, remember, they would get upset that Jesus healed somebody. Now, shouldn't they have had compassion on that person? Yeah, especially, one of them was a paralytic who had not walked in 30-some years, and then all of a sudden he was walking. They should have been jumping up and down with joy that a man was healed. But they weren't. They were upset because it was upsetting the balance of power that they had, because to them, Jesus was taking some of their power away. So remember, they were part of that woe statement I told you that Jesus was doing about how they were treating people. Remember, Jesus called them a bunch of snakes. So these were people, the Pharisees is a perfect example, these were people who were following the law to a T and making up some as they went too, but they were not doing what God really asked of them. So they were following the law without following God. Here's what he says in chapter 6, verse 6. He says, "With what shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" All right, so that's what he's asking. He said, shall I do these things for the Lord? Now, this goes back to the law about requiring sacrifices and doing things for dedicating the firstborn to the Lord and going back to all these things. Now, you can do that without actually following the Lord. Because listen to what he says here. Verse 8. "He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." All right? What he did there was he simplified what the entire law said. Jesus simplified it even further in the New Testament. When the two great commandments, when he said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." If you go back and read the law, That's what the law goes back to. It's talking about when you follow the law and you love God with all your heart. That's what it leads to. But it also allows you to love your neighbor as yourself. Those were two Old Testament laws that Jesus said. But here he just sums up. He said, this is what God wants.
Well, he made it easier, didn't he? Because he simplified it.
He simplified it right there. He said, this is what God wants. He said, if you're not carrying out justice. Now remember, justice here is talking about taking care of the poor, the orphans, the widows. Those were the primary things, taking care of their community. They ignored those things. The rich oppressed the poor. Those are things that God did not like. Those were things that went against the law. So when he says he wants them to do justice, which means he wants, if your neighbor's in need, help him out. Things like that. He said, and to love kindness, or have loving kindness, to have love for one another, and to walk humbly with God. Now, part of walking humbly with God is saying that you have sin in your life. Because part of the problem these people had, I don't think they were repentant.
Well, let me read this. This is in verse 8. Verse 8. It says, to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excuse me. I'm behind.
But that's just a simplification of what we should be doing.
Yeah.
And when we love God and follow the law, and we're following the law because we love God, we should do those things. But see, they were trying to follow the law to be legalistic.
Well, they was trying to follow the law and do their thing too.
Yeah. And so here it was just simplified. These things were simplified. It was the law made simple. And the rest of the chapter here, it talks about the treachery of its leaders, the treachery of the nations to God, and how God is going to judge them. Verse 15, he said, you shall sow but not reap. You shall tread olives but not anoint yourselves with oil. You shall tread grapes but not drink wine. So, in that there, he's talking about, all the things that they had done there in Judah. When Babylon comes down, they're not going to reap any of the fruits of their labor, because Babylon's going to come down and take it and destroy it. And they're going to be carted off to Babylon. Now, as we begin chapter 7, verses 1 through 7, now there's something here that should sound very familiar to you. It says, woe is me, for I have become as when the summer fruit has been gathered, as when the grapes have been gleaned. There is no cluster to eat, no first-rate fig that my soul desires. The godly has perished from the earth, and there is no one upright among mankind. They all lie in wait for blood, and each hunts the other with a net. Their hands are on what is evil, to do it well. The prince and the judge ask for a bribe, and the great man utters the evil desire of his soul. Thus they weave it together. The best of them is like a briar, the most upright of them a thorn hedge. The day of your watchman, of your punishment has come. Now their confusion is at hand. Put no trust in a neighbor. Have no confidence in a friend. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your arms. For the son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house. But as for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. Now what is interesting about that is that sounds like very similar language that Jesus used when he was talking about end times prophecy. Talking about the times in which when the end times were approaching, how, and even into the end times, how even family members, sons and daughters, would turn on their parents, and parents would turn on their daughters, and you couldn't trust anybody. So, Micah's using some end-time language here. But that was happening there. Because of the depravity of the people, the leadership, the prophets, the priests, and all of their misdeeds, the people followed suit. And so they were treating each other very poorly. And that's why they got judged. Not just the leadership, because the people fell into it too. As you look, a lot of times in America, we look at it and we look at the depravity. Well, you can look back at any nation. When a nation starts off well and they've got priorities in order, and then that depravity starts hitting the leaders and it starts trickling down into the people, when it hits total depravity, the end is soon to come.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a lot of that here in America. And I know people in America have been preaching this for a long time. There were preachers who said when Elvis, started, doing things a little different, the end times are upon us. That Elvis had nothing to do with that. But it's the things that people do, and you look at how people treat each other today. Look at how our politicians, our representatives, look at how they act. We're not so different than the nations of Israel and Judah. Even a lot of our churches look like this. You can go in churches where people just talk about each other all the time. They gossip about each other outside. There's a lot of parking lot gossip is what I call it. A lot of that goes on. Backroom board meetings. There's a lot of that stuff that happens in our churches. And so there's present day events that are not so different than what Micah was prophesying against. And if we think God's not going to judge us for those things, then we are sorely mistaken. He will bring judgment on our heads one way or another.
He will if he tarries.
Bless me. I tried to cover that up, but it seemed like it made it worse.
But as we continue on in the rest of chapter 7, Micah goes back to the idea of hope, repentance, and restoration. He's talking about a future time when Zion will be made new again. Zion will be great again. He's talking about these things. They're not going to happen on their own. It's only going to be through God. Yahweh is going to bring about these things once again when He when He comes down and He makes things right again. That's when these things are going to happen. And so we know that hasn't happened yet, but we know that here in chapter 7 he's talking about this shepherd who's going to lead his flock. And of course we know that that's talking about the future Messiah. Of course we know that's talking about Jesus. And we know that He is going to be that shepherd into the millennium. He's our shepherd now. But here he's talking about to the remnant, talking about those people, not just to us because He's already our shepherd, but He's talking to them that one day He's going to be their shepherd as well. So, just like Micah is just like the other 5 books that we've read so far in the Old Testament. There's most of it is comprised of judgment upon either Israel or Judah or both. But there's always glimpses of hope. There's always glimpses of restoration and future talk of this coming Messiah. And so there's, as gloomy as it looks, there's also hope in there too. So that's the book of Micah. And y'all got any questions or comments?
Well, it's just I run my mouth too much, I guess.
Nah.
But Israel become a state in 1948. And that's been and they really prospered. It's really a,
Mhm.
it's, you know, incredible, place to go and visit. And technology is blown out of the water. But probably less than 3% are Christians.
Yeah.
And
The percentage of religious people, people who actually adhere to their religion, is very small.
yeah,
And as we talked about, you know, before, there's a lot of cultural Jews, you know, cultural Muslims or whatnot, who don't really follow, who don't really follow their religion.
right. But their archaeology is finding stuff every day. I see what was the House of David?
Yeah.
It's a big museum. They're building on it right now,
Mm-hmm.
and it's gonna be really,
Yeah.
really something.
Oh, I bet. Well, they're finding stuff all the time. I was just reading this morning that they found you know, here in the first verse, it talks about being under the reign of Jotham. He was one of the kings of Judah, and so I was reading that where they had found one of the signet rings of King Jotham.
No,
I think they said they found it along the coastline somewhere, but I thought that was pretty neat. You know, it's just more evidence, you know, that he was.
verifies the Bible.
That's exactly right, and they keep finding it all the time.
Or just like, you know.
It's amazing whenever they find this stuff, it never disproves it.
No.
No, no.
It always verifies it.
Yeah. Or you just like Jeremiah, he was a great prophet. And Haman, Jeremiah just kept telling them what was gonna happen and
Yeah.
the right way to go. And Haman, he built a gallows and got hung on his own gallows.
Yeah. Well, you know, we don't, a lot of times we don't look a lot at the minor prophets, but if you look at what, you know, is quoted sometimes, like take Jeremiah for instance, you know, they could have quoted, you know, in certain instances, they could have quoted Isaiah or somebody, you know, some other people who was around the same time that Micah was, but they quoted Micah. And so, you know, as I told you before, minor prophets has nothing to do with the content, it just has to deal with the length of the book. The messages are powerful. You know, that they might be a little shorter, but they're equally as important as the major prophets. But I hope you're enjoying the study of this so far.
I am. You're a great teacher in my book.
Well, I'm trying to be humble before God and just,
And we sure do appreciate you.
just trying to help people understand the importance of the minor prophets. And
God's really using you in a great way.
well, I hope so. And I just want to do what He wants me to do. So, but I appreciate y'all. I couldn't do this if y'all didn't come.
I mean, you're a blessing to me and Nancy.
Yes.
You really are.
Yeah, me too.
Well, y'all are blessing me, and I appreciate it. And you know, I do look forward to this, and I'm glad you look forward to it too. So, but next week we'll be off because of Thanksgiving, but we'll pick it up the next week. But y'all go ahead. I think we're gonna do Nahum next. And Nahum is a short book, so I think we might do Nahum and then the book after, and I can't, that's it, that's what I thought it was, but I couldn't think of it. So we might do those two books when we come back, Nahum and Habakkuk. So y'all practice saying Habakkuk while you're gone. Habakkuk. See, I can't even look. Habakkuk. Habakkuk, that's it, Habakkuk. So y'all practice that, but Nahum's not too hard. But anyway, as far as pronouncing it, but anyway, we'll jump into those two books. those two. I know Nahum. I don't know that I've ever heard very much taught or preached out of Nahum, so I'm looking forward to getting there. Not too much, I think I have heard one or two sermons out of Habakkuk, but, so I'm interested in getting into those, learn a little bit about those two prophets, and we'll continue that. But appreciate y'all being here, and if there's nothing else, Ronnie, you close the prayer today?